This video is titled Ruth, an Example of Doing the Best. So the story of Ruth is a very important story in the scriptures, and it often goes overlooked because it is at least one book where God is not directly present. He's certainly there. I'm not trying to suggest that, but it is unlike other books of Judges or Exodus where God is directly involved and we hear about his involvement and what he's doing. And it's more of a bleak, Ruth is more of an oblique reference to God. But nonetheless, it is quite important of a book because of the example of Ruth and her example of doing her best. So the story of Ruth begins in the days when the judges ruled. And that's a very significant line because we know from the book of Judges that the Israelites were extremely wicked during this time, and hence why there was a famine. And so, what you're getting in this first verse is setting up a contrast between the wicked Israelites in the book of the Judges and faithful Ruth, who is a non Israelite and actually a Moabite. And so we learn at the beginning of Ruth that there was a man, Elimelech. He had wife Naomi, had two sons, and because of the famine, they moved from Israel, or that is Bethlehem, and went to Moab. And eventually the two sons married Moabite women. One is Orpah, and the other is Ruth. Then afterwards, they die, the two sons, and then Ruth and Orpah are left, and Orpah decides to stay, but Ruth decides to go with Naomi. So what we have here in this moment is we have an inflection point, and this inflection point is similar to inflection points in our life, where we're faced with a choice, and we get to decide how we are going to choose. And so Ruth had two choices. She could stay in Moab, potentially remarry. Um, the choice to stay in Moab was a safer choice. She's a Moabite, so less likely to be, well, not less likely, she won't be ostracized. She could likely find another husband and she can go back to the way things were. The other option is to follow Naomi, and this one comes at a greater risk because she's a Moabite going to an Israelite country, and she is going to be an outcast. Israelites and Moabites at this time did not have the best relationship, and that's largely because of how the Moabites treated the Israelites during the campaign of Joshua. But in any case, they are not in good standing, generally speaking, and so Ruth, as a Moabite, is running the risks of a lot of things, and she may not ever get married again. And she may remain in poverty because Naomi is a woman, and at this time, women couldn't own. Well, they could own land, but they couldn't. Uh, I mean, they could own land through the husband, but it was the job of the man who could expand or take out a loan or some to that effect. Women didn't have the right to enter into a contract. That's what I'm getting at. This is a marriage contract, and so there was a huge risk, given that Naomi was a widow, that Ruth would follow the same path. But as we know from the story, this is the better choice because of what following Naomi would yield. And why exactly Ruth decided to cleave to Naomi is uncertain, but we know that she does. And it's likely because somewhere along the way she heard of Israel's God, probably the stories. They probably, as I'm speculating here, but I think it's reasonable to assume that given the when they were married, Ruth, and when she married Israelite men, that they shared the story of God and how they got to their land of promise. And I'm sure Ruth even knew that about that before, and I'm sure the Moabites talked about it because at that time everyone knew of God and Yahweh and what He did for the Israelites during the campaign of Joshua and even with Moses in Exodus. It was well known, and so she had reasons to believe that Israel's God is better than the Moabite God, and that Naomi had something to offer. And so she chooses the best path. And how does God respond? Does He immediately bless her? Do things work out? Life is easy? No, not at all. So, what this shows is that often when you make the best choice, it's not going to be giving you the immediate rewards because the best choice often is the best choice because of what it yields in the long term, not the short term. And so she still had to act and she still had to face uncertainty. And she did not know how it was going to turn out, but she believed it to be best and she was right in that. And so she decided to act. And so Ruth then decides to take an action furthering her vision of what is best. And she says, well, we need to get food. So I'm going to go to the field and I'm going to glean. And so what she does here, she takes advantage of what is immediately available to her. She works within the restrictions or the constraints she has. And she goes and takes advantage of gleaning. And gleaning, for those not aware, is that in the law of Moses, those who own fields were required under the law to leave the edges unharvested so that the poor could come in and glean from the harvest, take what was remaining. But oftentimes, what was remaining was not the freshest, it was hard work, but it was still food. And so that is what she decides to do. And then we get Boaz, who is overseer and owner of this land, and he sees Ruth and he is intrigued by what she's doing. Um, he asks who she is. His servant says it's a Moabite, came back from Moab with Naomi. She's here to glean, and she's been here all day. And we don't know when this conversation is happening, but we know that Ruth has been there for some time. So sometime for the um, uh, overseer, the servant, the worker, to notice Ruth and explain that to Boaz. And so Boaz apparently is intrigued by Ruth's diligence, and he tells her, "Okay, I'm going to have you uh, not glean anymore. Stay here, work with the women, and I will um, provide wheat for you, and you also have water that you can drink from." And so, what's interesting here is this is just a slight help that God provides, but He's able to provide it because Ruth acted according to her best. She put herself in a situation where God could bless her. And God blesses her by letting Ruth work near other women. So she is safe, right? Because she's around a company of people. So she's not likely to be assaulted. And she also has access to water. So she can get water when she's thirsty. And now she's not gleaning anymore. She's getting the harvest. So she still has to work a little bit, but it's not the same extent. But because she acted according to her best, this was able to happen. And so Ruth was noticed not because of her, well, at least Boaz noticed Ruth not because of her looks, but it was because of her character. And often when a woman is attractive in the scriptures are clear to mention that. But they don't do that with Ruth. So it's not Ruth's looks that gain cause her to gain favor. It's the fact of her character, that she's willing to go out in the hot sun and glean, which is not easy, which is tough. And as you can see in this photo, is basically what she'd be doing. She'd be trying to find any wheat that she could that was on the floor. And the key is that if Ruth was anyone different, she likely would not have been noticed by Boaz. But because of her character, Boaz noticed her. And what we're going to see in this story is that Ruth's character compounds to greater blessings. As she continues to act to do her best, she receives greater blessings as a result. And so the final period comes where the harvest is over, and it's important for Ruth to approach Boaz because she learns that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, or a goel. And she approaches him, and I believe this is on the instruction of Naomi, but in any case, she approaches him, and where she approaches him is a little bit odd because she's coming to him in the middle of the night, and she's approaching Boaz as he's laying and sleeping, and she comes to his garment and to his feet. And this is actually a pretty provocative suggestion because women at that time did not go out at night. Respectable women. Now, if you were a prostitute, that's what you'd be doing. You'd go out at night looking for a client. But so Ruth had the risk of being accused of being a prostitute, of someone who was disreputable, and it could have hurt her image. But she does it anyways because she knows that Boaz is her kinsman redeemer, and that she, by marrying him, would be redeemed in the sense of given land and a home and shelter and so forth. And Boaz responds recognizing Ruth's choice. And we further learn about Ruth's character. We learn in this moment that Ruth, instead of going after younger men in the village, decided to remain faithful to Naomi and provide for her. And he says, all the people of my town, they know that you are a woman of noble character. And I believe that phrase is the same thing used in Proverbs 31 to describe a virtuous woman. And so Ruth is someone who is a virtuous woman according to Proverbs 31. Someone who is thrifty, someone who's hardworking and diligent and resourceful. And so we learn that's who she was, and she acted according to that. And as she did so, she yielded the fruits of that character. And the result is that Boaz promised to redeem her. Now, there's more to the story, but she does get redeemed. She marries Boaz. She has Obed, and then Obed has Jesse, and Jesse has David. So Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. So that's a pretty awesome thing as well. But the more important thing is that Ruth, taking the risk, actually was given a better opportunity, because now not only was she married, but she was married to a wealthy man who could provide for her, provide for Naomi, and give her the protection and shelter that she needed. And so what we get from here is that Ruth always did what was best. And what was best is sacrificing the present comfort for the long-term reward. She gave up present beliefs to follow Naomi. First started with gleaning the barley or the wheat harvest. And then eventually, by making those choices, she was recognized for her character and was able to be blessed with further blessings. But it came at an initial cost. And the reward was not immediate. But by doing her best, the blessings compounded. And so the same applies to us. each and every day we have a choice. And when choice is, we don't just have one choice to make. We have many choices in the day that we're making. And to optimize the blessings that God can give us requires us to make the best choice in each and every choice we make. Because when you make the best choice, you open up God's ability to bless you, right? Because if Ruth didn't go with Naomi or didn't go to glean the harvest, well, then how would God put Boaz in Ruth's way? It'd be very difficult. He may have another way of doing it, but we don't know. But what we do know is that by doing the best, she was in a position where God could bless her. And so that's the same aspect with us. Truly, if you want to receive God's blessings, which greatest blessings are happiness, which we're all after, it requires you to do your best. It requires you to be like Ruth. And by so doing, God can then, you put yourself in an opportunity where God can then help you. He can give you and lead you to even better choices. Because if you do what is best, and then you get corrected on that, then you have a chance to even do something better than what you thought was best, and it just compounds. And when you make the right choices, the right consequences follow. And so the story of Ruth is a beautiful story because what it shows and why I love it so much is it shows that obedience to God and righteousness comes in the daily choices we make. And we sometimes want God to be, or we want to be in the story of Joshua or the Exodus story, where we're seeing these miracles, seeing God's miraculous, mighty power. But the greater thing is to learn how to discern the simple choices, or should I say, how to discern the choices in our lives, in the mundane day-to-day things, because those will yield the greater blessings, because those will shape your character. Miracles don't do that. Being led and given manna is cool and everything, but eventually the Israelites were like, okay, now I'm tired of this, right? They didn't see what was happening, but when you continually make the right choice, you start to shape your character to then be at a place where God can bless you in ways that he couldn't bless you with miracles, or I guess in more pronounced miracles, right? And it's not to say miracles are bad, but it's the better thing to do is to live as your best so that you can expand the opportunities on what is available to you, just as it was for Ruth.